2. Hello, everyone, and happy Tuesday. You know, it is no secret that today's webinar presenter, Dr. Tom Necela, is one of my all-time favorites. In fact, you will notice that I have him on here as often as I can because, well, he's fabulous. For starters, he was the first chiropractor ever to achieve the Certified Professional Medical Auditor status. And since I'm going through this phase in my career right now, I can tell you that it's no easy feat. He has combined his background as a former insurance claims analyst and his certifications as a professional coder and a professional compliance officer, which give him a very unique perspective on many of the insurance-based challenges chiropractors face today. On top of that, from his own personal experience in selling his own practice, he has so much knowledge and has been able to help so many chiropractors who are transitioning to that phase in their life or planning ahead as they're preparing for retirement. Hands down, he also has the most amazing blog ever. If you are not following strategic chiropractor.com or the Strategic DC, I know I said that wrong, but I promise you that it is the one blog that I read and check on at least twice a week because he is my go-to man for all the what's going on in the chiropractic world as far as insurance, billing, coding, Medicare, everything. And it's beautifully written on top of that. So anyway, I'm just going to quit gushing, turn it over to Dr. Tom Necela. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, thanks so much, Christy, and thank all of you for being with us here, wherever you may be. And as Christy said, we're going to be talking about your practice sale and transition today. In fact, the 10 biggest factors that are going to affect the value of your chiropractic practice sale or transition. So what we want to do is kind of go to the other side of the fence. As Christy had mentioned at strategicdc.com, we like to teach chiropractors how to work smarter, not harder. And that may mean in business, in terms of billing, coding, insurance, documentation, compliance, all that stuff. And then eventually you get to the point where we say, how do we transition out? And we want to teach you how to work smarter doing that as well. And that's going to be the focus of this webinar. And specifically, again, we're going to talk about the 10 biggest factors that will affect the value of your chiropractic practice sale or transition. I like to call these the exit essentials. You know, if you don't know about these things, it is highly likely you're going to either make a mistake when you go to sell or transition your practice, or you will lose value because these factors absolutely affect what you have to sell or transition. So let's kind of start with, there are a lot of questions that swarm around your head when you begin to see what I call the light at the end of the tunnel, when you get a little bit further down in your career, or you start thinking about maybe when you want to exit or when you want to sell or retirement or anything like that. And in order to maximize the value of your sale or your transition, these questions are important. And so we'll just start there. And the very first question that probably pops in your head is you say, well, when? You know, when is the right time for you to transition? And in fact, as we dive into this webinar, I'm going to show you exactly when would be the ideal time and when are the bad times that unfortunately too many chiropractors use to transition their sale or their practice. So then the second question that pops in your head, if you're thinking about when, is, well, who will be the one? You know, the person that I will transition or sell my practice to. And some of you are in the stage of your career where you might have a specific person in mind. Perhaps you even have a son or daughter, associate, someone maybe that has approached you about working with you or purchasing your practice. And then there are others of you that have absolutely no clue who will be the one. So then the next question in your head is, well, how do I find that person? And again, it's easy if somebody's in your office. Actually, it's simple, but it's not necessarily easy because sometimes associates have their own challenges and even family members. So how will I find that right person to sell or transition my practice to is an important question to ask. That will lead you then to the fourth question, which is really, and how long does that take? In fact, this is probably the question too many chiropractors forget to ask. So that's why I want to include it, because I don't want you to forget or assume that it's very, very quick and easy to find somebody. I mean, let's just take what it takes and look at that from a big picture perspective. When you go to sell or transition your practice, one of the first things you have to find is someone that actually wants to live in your part of the world. So, if you're in the United States, you're in one of 50 states, and obviously they not only need to live in your state, but in your town. Now, they also need to be able to be interested in your option, meaning you want to sell, or you maybe want to have them as an associate first, or you maybe want to offer some sort of partnership, whatever it might be. And then that narrows the field down, and then they also have to be a good fit for the practice in terms of philosophy, style, and they also have to be able to afford your purchase and your sale, whatever the price may be. And guess what? They have to be able to do it in your time frame, and their time frame need to match. So that's a lot of things that need to kind of line up. So don't assume that this happens necessarily quickly. We're going to talk about that a little bit as we go on in today's presentation as well. That leads us to the fifth and probably the big question that many of you maybe even start with is, what's it worth? Now, I like to say there's kind of two questions wrapped up inside this one. And the first is, well, what's it worth in terms of on paper or what you might have heard, or something in terms of a practice valuation or appraisal, what, some friend or somebody something you read might have told you. And then there's, well, what's it worth in terms of getting a buyer to buy? That's where we ultimately have to say, hey, show me the money, because it might be worth one thing on paper, but if you don't have anyone to sell it to, or if you can't get them to finance it or buy in, that is another matter. So with that, I'd just love to pause, because I know this is a big question for many of you, and see if you have any idea in terms of what it's worth. Go ahead and use that question panel on your screen. And I want you to answer this in one of three ways. If you have had an appraisal or evaluation done on your practice and you know what it's worth, then put an A, and you can indicate the number. I'm not going to call out any names or anything like that. If you have a guess based on something you've read or something you've heard, put a G and guess a number there. And then if you have no clue, then I want you to write an N, and that means no clue. And here's what this is going to do for me and for all of us here on this webinar. It's just going to give us some perspective on where everyone is at, because, I want to make this the most relevant presentation to you. So again, an A if you've had an appraisal or evaluation and a number, a G if you guess a number based on something you've read or heard, and an N with no clue, and that just tells me where you are at. So we've got our first really, really honest person that comes through, and we've got an N coming through, and looks like we're getting a few more N's will come through, a couple guess, and I'm sure as we go through here that somebody somewhere will have an appraisal, but the N's are winning right now in terms of most of you have no clue. And here's the interesting thing, and in many ways it's a little bit of a trick question, and I'll tell you why. Because there is no one universal formula to appraise or value a chiropractic practice. So those of you who have written in N, and you are many, you don't have to feel bad for that N. And in fact, there are the second place is easily the G's, the guesses. And if we probably asked you how you guessed, we'd come up with a number of different answers based on the fact that, again, there's no one formula. So that will lead you to what I actually consider the sixth and most important question, which is, what's the best route for me? You see, once you figure out the value, or interestingly enough, perhaps part of how your practice is valued is also dependent on the route that you choose. So in other words, there are some routes that you can choose that actually will enhance the value of your chiropractic where others will decrease it. Now, I need to also separate 4 quick differences for you as we talk about the factors that influence the value, because people have an assumption on these things and it's not always correct. Okay, so the first difference we need to just kind of distinguish is inspiration versus desperation. Everyone obviously wants to be the guy on the left-hand side who is inspired to plan ahead and plan for his sale or his transition so that by the time he gets there, or certainly a little before that, he is then able to present his sale and do what I call present and sell. In other words, it's just say, here's what we have to offer, here's the route, here's the options, here's what it costs, as opposed to the lady over on the right who's holding the help sign and look like she's a little bit desperate because in her desperation, she did not plan, and therefore she is a plead and sell. And unfortunately, you see many chiropractors, many chiropractic practices on the market that are in the right-hand category. In fact, if I had to guess, I would probably say the vast majority of practices on the market today are on the right-hand picture, that plead and sell. And I don't want you to be one of them because, as you may imagine, you're not going to maximize your value by being there. So then the next differentiation that we need to make is interest versus income. Now, this is a big mistake that chiropractors make in that they think because people are interested in their practice or that people may be attracted to their location or what the practice looks like or sounds like, that equates to its value, and it does not. So interest really relates to attraction, meaning how many people would be potentially interested in hearing more about your practice, versus income, which is really the value of the practice. So again, you could have a practice that's very interesting. It's in a very popular area, location. So for example, if your practice is located at the beach, if it's one of the top cities in the country, if it's up in a mountain area, a nice resort, something like that, it'd be very attractive to many buyers. But that does not mean that it's more valuable. In fact, you can have a practice that's in the middle of the prairie, in the middle of nowhere, and value in terms of what that practice is worth based on what it's collecting, what it's doing, what the owner is making might be more valuable. Now, the hard part is you really need a little of both, don't you? You need both interest or attraction and value to maximize it. So that's where we're going to talk about these 10 factors on how we can help steer things in the right direction for our sale or for our transition. And the very first factor that we need to talk about is cash flow. Really, cash flow comes down to this very simple phrase. It's not what you make, it is what you keep. And so here is also where some of the ballpark formulas for valuation begin to fall apart. So for example, we can take 2 practices, both collecting $500,000 a year. And we say, well, what's a practice worth? And somebody might throw out some sort of multiple, some sort of percentage or something. But what if one of those practices collects $300,000 in terms of the owner income after overhead, and the other one, the owner only takes home $100,000? They both collected $300,000, but the one owner took home $300,000, the other one took home $100,000. Which one do you think is more valuable? Well, it's easy. The one where the owner took home more money because the cash flow is better. In other words, that owner made more. So cash flow is very, very important, not necessarily just collections. The second factor that's very important is obviously related to the cash flow is the performance trend. So not only do you want to tweak your practice if you're trying to maximize value to have it produce as much cash as possible to you, you also want to time that cash flow in terms of the performance of your practice so that a trend is going in the right direction. If you do that by timing the performance trend correctly, then it's the difference between a significant demand for your practice and the value it might command versus a serious discount. Let me show you what that looks like. For example, if we just do the math on the impact of a 5-year downward spiral. In other words, let's say 5 years ago your practice was doing $500,000 and it went down about $50,000 a year. It went down to 450, 400, 350, 300,000. Overall, you saw about a 40% decline. Okay? Well, what happens if that trend continues? Well, we go 250, then to 200, then to 150, down to 100, and in 5 years the practice is only collecting $50,000. Or if you just lopped it off and said, hey, let's just overall decline it by 40%, it's sitting at 180,000. Either way, this looks bad. And what does it mean for the impact of your sale or your transition? It means you're likely going to face a price discount. In other words, you won't be able to command a premium price because the trend is going downward. And any buyer or any bank looks at that and, quite frankly, gets a little scared. So if we flip that around and we look at the performance trend of a 5-year upward spiral using the exact same numbers, but just reversing that order. Let's say 5 years ago your practice was doing 300,000 and it walked all the way up that same 40% increase to 500,000, then what would happen in the next 5 years? Well, it would keep going up 50,000 a year and get to 750, or just a general 40% increase. You say this practice looks great either way. What does that mean for a bank? They're excited because they can see the numbers going in the right direction. They want to lend on a practice like that. What does that mean for a buyer? They're excited because they say, wow, this practice is going in the right direction. I just want to step inside this thriving business. What does that mean for you? That means you may be able to command a firm or premium price based on the performance trend. So that's what I mean by the second factor that is very, very important to maximizing the value of your sale or transition is the performance trend. Now, the one thing that I'd love to know from you, maybe even just drive this point home, is where's your performance trend? So give me a U if it's going up, give me a D if it's going down, give me an S if it's staying the same. I'm not going to share anybody's name here, but I will love to know, and again, to try to make this most relevant presentation for you guys, where you're at. And also, I think just the fact of typing that one little letter is going to hit home this message that it is important to time your practice sale or transition with the trend. So again, if it's going up, give me a U. If it's going down, give me a D. If it's going staying the same, give me an S. I want to see where you're at here. So first one in with the fast fingers has a U as an answer, Dr. Karen. Congratulations. Awesome. Okay. So again, here we're going to get in. My guess is a nice little smattering from each of those areas. And what do we do with that? Well, if you just listen to what I said about the performance trend, then if your trend is staying the same or your trend is going down, then obviously you want to turn that around, or as we'll show later, time your transition appropriately. Okay, we have a few more U's coming in, and we have a few S's, another U. Okay, we've got a D, but here's the good news for this group, Smarter Than the Average Bears. We've got a lot of S's, a lot of U's. Okay, so let's go over to the next key factor, which is really key players. So when you sell your business, you have to imagine that one of the things that you are selling, the major thing that you're doing, is called goodwill. What is goodwill exactly? Well, goodwill means that these patients, this business's performance that the buyer may see today is likely to continue tomorrow, right? Because literally you can't force your patients to come and see a new buyer, even if it's your associate. You can't force them to say you have to see this person in the future. But what goodwill means is, hey, it's likely that we're going to do everything we can to transition or sell this practice so that the goodwill is intact and they go over towards the new buyer. Now, the reality of it is you are only a piece of that goodwill, and your ability to adjust patients is a huge piece, but it's only a part of the puzzle because there are other people in place. And these we call your key players that also affect that goodwill. In fact, I call the OPS, the owner, that's you, providers, and staff. Now, some of you are in a position where you are the owner, you may be the sole provider, and the only staff is your spouse. This is the most dangerous position. Here's why. When you and presumably your spouse leave to sell the practice, that means it's a total change of hand. All key players have left. That's the most risky category, right? But what if you're on the other side of the fence and you as the owner actually only provide some of the services and you have other providers, whether that be chiropractors or massage therapists, medical doctors, acupuncturists, I don't know, rehab people, whatever it is. There's other income streams coming in from other providers, and guess what? You have other staff that know how to run the business. So key players can affect the attractiveness and the value of that business because, again, it's either a risky transaction where everybody's going to leave and somebody new is going to take over, or it's a transaction where you go, you know what, I'm only working part-time right now. This ship sails well without me, and that is also one of the reasons that when we work with clients, the transition is also very important. So, for example, if you could say to a buyer, yes, I'm leaving, I'm the only provider, but I'm willing to stay around for an extended transition to make sure everything goes smoothly for you, then you can mitigate or lower some of that risk of these key player factors. Okay, so let's look at factor number 4. And it's an interesting one because it is your equipment. Now, again, like I said, most of what we sell when we sell our transition to practice is your goodwill. But there is equipment that you have sitting inside the office that whoever would buy your practice is going to get to use. And it's sold along with the business. So that leads many chiropractors to the question, oh, Tom, should I upgrade my equipment? One of the most common things I'll get is, oh, you know what? We never got on EMR, or we don't have a digital x-ray. Should I get that to make my practice more attractive to a buyer? Well, here's the reality of that. On one hand, it may be more attractive. Meaning it's possibly more attractive, but what if you bought an x-ray and the buyer doesn't even want to do x-ray? Well, then it's not more attractive. What if you bought an EMR system, they don't like that EMR system, they liked another EMR system, then it's not more attractive. But the other thing, remember we said the difference between attractiveness and interest or value is this, that you buying that equipment is a little bit like buying a car. When you drive it off the lot, it's worth less than you paid for it. So my rule of thumb here is, yes, the equipment does convey value for your business, but do not buy more equipment to add value or add attractiveness. Now, I always have somebody that takes me very literally, and last year we got an email from one of our clients that said, Tom, I know you said don't buy any more equipment, but guess what? The copier broke. And yes, we put the practice on the market for sale. I know you said don't buy anything, so should we replace the copier? Yes. My rule of thumb there is, hey, do you need that thing to run the business? And in the case of a copier, probably the answer is yes. But that lets you know that, hey, your equipment is valuable. So you know what? You paid all that money for all the equipment. And those of you who have a ton of it, it does convey value. But by the same token, don't buy more to try to add more value. Now, the 5th factor that I'd like to speak to you about is called earnings exposure. And this is one that people don't often think of, but the general gist of it is that the greater the risk for your earnings, the lower it will impact your practice value. In other words, if you have a greater risk, then it's lower value. So here's what I mean by this. If we had to strive for anything, it would be to strive to be Swiss in chiropractic. And what that means in terms of your income is that cash is best. And here's why. When you have somebody pay you cash, you're not waiting for your money like an insurance claim. There's very little chance that anyone's going to take the money back like an insurance audit. And there's also very little chance that someone would pay you incorrectly like insurances do as well. So cash is kind of the top income level, so to speak. Now, I also love Switzerland for the fact that it not only has beautiful mountains, but they have cheese and chocolate. So that would be a mix in your practice of cash and insurance. Now, if we want to go down the line and get a little more riskier, you want to avoid payer dominance, because if your practice is all the income is dependent on like one major payer, or you have one major payer that's the majority of your income, and something happens, well, from my knowledge of the other side of the fence, this happens more often than we like to admit, and that makes your practice and your income and your sale a little bit more risky. And finally, those of you who are in a very narrow niche have some risk as well. And what I mean by narrow niche is, let's say your practice is 100% PI, dependent on all the attorney and referrals, or something where you're all work comp, and then all of a sudden, work comp dries up in your state, or you're in a very narrow niche in terms of, hey, I do this one thing, and that is good in terms of lack of competition, but it also does not diversify your income. So the bottom line is to try to stay neutral as possible. Now, this does not mean to, all of a sudden change your entire practice at this stage in the game. But if you're looking at value, there is more value in those of you who have cash income streams. Okay. So the sixth factor in terms of things that will affect the value of your practice, sale, or transition is recurring revenue. And this is one that very few chiropractors actually think about. But interestingly enough, it is one that can be very attractive and also ease the anxiety of a potential buyer or someone that's looking to transition in your practice. And here's why. One of their fears when they purchase a practice is that if you go away, the patients go away. Right? And most specifically, the fear is, and the income from those patients go away. So if you can show them that this business has recurring revenue, in other words, that it has income streams that continue on, then they might lessen their fears, or this will be more attractive to them in terms of your sale, and even translate into a better value. So let me show you what this means here. There are two primary types of recurring revenue. The first is accounts receivable, and the second is what I call auto debit revenue. Now, in terms of accounts receivable, this adds limited value to your practice, but it is tangible value. And here's why. Your practice is worth what it's worth, and then the accounts receivable are sort of optional or negotiable. In other words, when people like myself do a practice valuation, there are certain formulas that do not even add in or value your accounts receivable. So if you were to sell the accounts receivable, that would be in addition to what your practice is worth. Okay, so it does add some limited value. And the reason I say it's limited is simply because this is limited time income for the buyer. It does provide them with cash flow after the sale. So, for example, if they buy your practice today and they bought the accounts receivable with it, just like your business goes on now, you get checks tomorrow, you get checks next week, and eventually they'll run out from the work that you did in the past. So it's limited income. It's also discounted income for you as the seller because, well, I hate to break bad news to you. If you have $100,000 of accounts receivable, that doesn't mean, oh, if I add in the accounts receivable with the sale of my practice, it's going to be worth $100,000 more. No, it won't. It is discounted income because the reality of the situation is that if you have $100,000 of accounts receivable, it is not likely that $100,000 will come in. You might get 80. You might get 60. You might get 40. It may even depend on whether that accounts receivable is PI income, whether it's insurance, whether it's patient portions that come in. And so again, regardless of where the accounts receivable is be coming from, it will be discounted. So that's why it is valuable, but it's limited value. Now, auto debit income is different. And what I mean by auto debit income is income that is derived from monthly services, memberships, or products. So for example, let's say that you have a monthly service that is delivered where the payments automatically are withdrawn from the patient account. So for example, let's say you have massage therapists that have some sort of massage program where once a month somebody gets a massage, and every month X number of dollars gets debited from that patient's account, whether or not they get the massage. Or maybe you have a wellness program that does the same thing. Or maybe you sell nutritional supplements, and you have your patient on an auto ship. All of this is what I call auto debit income. And here's what that means for the new buyer. When they step in, this auto debit income continues. In fact, it's the exact same as what you've been getting, except the money's going not in your bank account anymore, but in theirs. And so this is very attractive to them. Now, I'll make one differentiation. This is not the same as prepay. In fact, prepay is a little odd when you go to sell, because the patients have already paid you, you just have not delivered all the care yet. And so prepay plans, some of the buyers look at them and go, oh, well, that's horrible. I mean, you already got the money. I got to do all the work. Well, here's the good news. It's not quite that bad, because, yes, you did get the money. Yes, they have to do the work, but they also have the ability now to build that relationship with the patient. Because the patient did pay for the care, they're likely to come in and use it. And so in the event of buyers worrying that, patient attrition and patients keep coming, prepays are great, because in that sense, that patient's coming to get their money's worth. They'll get to build a new relationship with a new doctor. And so you're not giving extra money for prepays, but they're not as bad, and they're definitely not the same as auto debit income. Okay, so then the seventh factor, and in fact, the final factor of things that go in the right direction for your value and your sale, is what I call supply and demand. Now, in a very simple way, we just look at supply and demand like the Monopoly game. If you're playing Monopoly and you got all the houses and hotels on the block, pretty much as soon as somebody comes in your neighborhood, you're making money. And if you were the only chiropractor in town, you'd have the same deal. Somebody wants to buy it, they got to come to you, they pay what you ask. In most scenarios, this is not the case when you go to sell or transition your practice. Supply and demand is very rarely a monopoly. So then you have to look at supply and demand from two different angles. The first is what I call the global market. In other words, how many people are looking to sell? How many people are looking to buy? Now, here I have good news for you. If you heard me speak anywhere in the last several years, I would have told you that the market was a bit lopsided and it was a very buyer-friendly market. Now, here you are, and your generation likely on the left. And that is the primary reason why a lot of chiropractors are entering or in that baby boomer generation. It's the biggest generation on the planet. And so just in terms of raw numbers, you outnumber the buyers who are likely to be in the millennial generation. But here's an interesting thing that happened that I don't think I could have predicted, and maybe no one could have predicted about the millennials. For all the criticisms waged at the millennials, they are actually sizing up to be quite good buyers for you. And in fact, they are evening out the market to where it is no longer just a buyer's market in their favor. And here's why. One of the things that people criticize the millennials for is they said they want instant gratification. Well, here's the deal. If they start their practice from scratch, they're not going to be making a lot of money. You know this. You probably started yours from scratch. And so instant gratification goes against them just starting the practice from scratch. In fact, instant gratification also goes against the other thing that millennials get accused of is having an entitlement syndrome. They kind of feel that they're entitled to a great living or great earnings because they're a doctor. Well, when they work as an associate, that entitlement syndrome gets dashed, because now they're going to be making associate level wages. If they start from scratch, they might not even make associate level wages. But guess what? These two factors go in your favor, because if they purchase a practice, they can get the instant gratification of actually assuming your wage. In other words, when you leave, they're basically buying your business, saying, hey, it's going to go this, has a track record of paying you all this. You leave, you step out of the picture, and they'll get your income. So this goes very much along with the millennial mindset, and it goes in your favor, so much so that what we've seen is they are really looking for practices, and even though they're maybe outnumbered by the baby boomers, the global market is nearing neutral. In other words, it's just as hard for you to sell and find a great person to buy as it is for them to find a great situation that might meet all of their requirements. Okay, so this is good news for you as buyer, and it's essentially now a neutral market. Now, the other aspect of supply and demand, we said not was only global, but local. And here are what we mean by local market variables. So if you're in an area where there is a closed insurance panel, well, and you are selling your practice and you have a providership on that panel, that's very attractive, and that can add value to your practice sale for a buyer. If you're in an area with low competition, obviously, and you can say, hey, I'm the only practice in town or one of the few, then that's attractive. The local economy is good. So all of these local variables are affected by and affect the interest or the attractiveness of your buyer, and they can also affect your income. Now, I said those were the 7 factors, and they're all positive factors that can kind of help your practice go in the right direction. But if you can recall, this webinar talked about 10 factors, and there are 3 left that can all damage your sale. So I want to speak to you about those because it's very important to know about these as well. We hinted at it before, but the biggest one here is your transition timing. And certainly it could be positive, but the statistics show that your transition timing is likely to be a damaging factor, which is why I want to tell you about it, because it's not only the most important, but it's also the most controllable factor. So in other words, you can literally take the reins on this and help yourself out, or you can follow the crowd and be like most people and time it wrong. So with this, I have something that I like to talk about called the sell curve. And really all this is a simple bell curve that follows the path of how most businesses work, and certainly chiropractic practices. And we start here on the left-hand side of the graph in the struggle phase, where we're new in practice, few years in practice, and our income is low. As we continue on in years, the income generally increases to the point where we get a little more stability. We're not worried that the doors will close, anything like that. And then we kind of go up toward the peak of our success. Now, the peak of your success in terms of income can be different from your neighbors. It could have taken you slightly longer to get there. And some people are able to ride on top for quite a while. But what tends to happen is the very things that you did on the left side of the curve to build your practice up towards that success, you begin to slack off on. In other words, you get a little tired. You don't want to do the same things, or you kind of rest on your accomplishments a little bit. And guess what happens with that slack phase? Your income begins to slack as well. Now, if that happens long enough before your sale or transition, it actually begins to get negative momentum. And then you enter what I call the slip phase, where not only have the slack affected your income, but now it's really going in the wrong direction. And so if you were to sell your practice or transition out of practice, you say, well, when would I want to do that? Well, everybody looks at the graph and says, of course, I want to do it in success. And you know what? I guess if I had to, probably somewhere in slack. But the reality of it is, statistics show that most small businesses, and this is you, 60% of them will sell or transition in the slip phase. Obviously, with the value affected, 20% will sell or transition in the slack phase, and only 10% sell in the success phase. And those of you who are good at math say, Tom, what about the other 10%? That lays over here in the stability phase. Yes, some people have a change of circumstance and actually sell while the practice is still building and growing. And if you're really particular, you say, well, what about the ends of the graph? Well, in the struggle phase, there's no income and there's nothing to sell. Nobody wants it. And guess what? At the very end of the graph, beyond the slip, there's really nothing to sell. No one wants that either. So in terms of timing, obviously, one of the key factors to affecting the value of your practice is to make sure that you don't wait too long. The next factor, which would be either number 9 or the second negative factor, is what we call undocumented systems. Now, as I mentioned previously, the majority of what you're selling is goodwill. You do have systems in your practice and procedures in place for you to take care of your patients. And if the goodwill is that those patients will continue to come in and the practice will perform as it has in the past, one of the biggest dangers that you have to yourself is undocumented systems, meaning that when you leave, all of the systems, the procedures, and the knowledge of how to run that office goes out the door with you. So literally, if you look at it from another angle, you have a treasure map in either your head or in your bank account. And it's going to be in one of those two places. If you have undocumented systems, that treasure map stays in your head and leaves with you as you leave the practice, and your value is affected or negatively impacted by it. Or if you have documented your systems, literally somebody could walk in there and go, hey, you know what? I know how they take care of new patients. I know how they run the office. I know how collections are handled. I know how they take care of the procedures of day-to-day visits. All of this stuff is documented. Then a buyer will see that because, again, what are they trying to buy? They're trying to buy the ability to reproduce what you have. And if that's in writing, then that is going to be in your bank account. But here's why I listed this factor in the damage section. I would probably say 80 or more % of chiropractors do not have their systems, their procedures, or their processes documented to the degree that somebody could come in. Think McDonald's here. You know, McDonald's could take a 16-year-old, put him behind the register, and the place doesn't blow up, right? Now, some of you have a office manager that has an MBA, you have a fleet of staff, you have all these people, and nobody knows how to run the place, and it's evidence every time you take a vacation by the number of calls you have and the number of things that blow up while you're gone. So the choice here is really to document those systems and reap the benefits, or to keep it all in your brain and pay the penalty. Now, the third and final factor of the negatives, or the 10th biggest factor that will affect the value of your sale, is what I call inflexibility. See, many chiropractors do not realize how flexible they must be to get this deal done. And by flexible, I don't mean you need to give it away. But remember, we said before when we were talking about what does it really take for somebody to buy or transition into your practice? They have to have a desire to be in your state, in your location, your technique, your price range, your time frame, all of that. So the challenge is, if you are completely inflexible, you are Dr. Stubborn, you will sell last or not at all. But if in your attitude you can say, hey, you know what? I realize there's a lot of things that have to line up to make this work. And if I have a prospect that I think is pretty good, and again, they don't have to be a clone of you. They don't have to be perfect in all aspects. Then I'm going to be flexible enough to take that through and make that person work, unless, you know, something major stops me. But some people have such a set of criteria when they go to sell or transition. I can just talk to them in a few minutes, tell them it's not going to happen. You know, I want to sell for $1 million to a one-eyed, one-armed woman from Kansas, even though my business has never done over $200,000. I don't want to finance a single thing. I've got to be out by June. My lease is up in, May. That's not going to happen, right? That is inflexible. So with that, I want to talk to you about a few options to overcome inflexibility. In fact, how you can gain more flexibility. I want to show it to you from two different angles, the interest and the income. So when we talk about interest, remember that's attractiveness, okay? So if we want to say, well, what's the most attractive, the easiest thing to invite interest versus the least? Well, the least attractive is actually the traditional partnership, where you take on somebody who's going to buy half of your practice, and the both of you are going to go forward together. It's tough to find somebody that wants to do that. Now, one more attractive than that is what we call the hybrid partnership, where you could sell a portion of your practice, not necessarily the whole thing. And that adds a little bit of attractiveness because maybe they don't have to come up with as much money. The traditional sale is neutral. That's sort of the default setting in terms of practice transition or sales. That's what they're used to, so we rate that as neutral. The sell and switch is an option where you literally sell the business on the front end, but then you stay on for an extended transition with your buyer and you work with or for them. Now, this is an advantage over the traditional sale because it solves the buyer's fears that when you leave, all the patients leave because you don't leave immediately. And it also helps solve some of the bank's fears, which coincidentally are the same. Then we have an associate buyout where literally somebody starts to work for you as an associate. They give you a down payment and then they buy the rest over time. And the most attractive is a buy-in, no money down. In fact, if you say, hey, Tom, how do I get the most people interested in my practice? We'll go, hey, well, let me sell you this. I'm going to pay you over $100,000 a year and you can buy my practice with no money down. Woo, you will have lots of people that are knocking on your door if you're in a reasonable place in the country. But that may not be the value that you want to get out of your practice, and then you might not want to take in the risk of that scenario. So that's where we kind of merge that with options to increase value. So if we look at that, when we look at the traditional sale, which again is the default setting, you get your face value. You know, if you sold your practice for $300,000, that's what you get, and you sail on off to your second act, your retirement, whatever the next step is. If you do a sell and switch, well, you get the face value of what you sold the practice for. But when I said you stay on for an extended transition afterward, I didn't mean you had to do that for free. So if you stay on for 6 months or something like that to help the buyer transition, they would pay you to do that. So you actually would get the face value of the sale, and then you would get whatever the transition value is, what they paid you to stay afterward. An associate, a buy-in or buy-out, then you have the potential of the face value of the eventual sale. You have the potential of the employee profit as they're your associate along the way. And then since you're essentially financing it, the value of whatever the interest rate is that you're charging. So there's more potential value there. And again, some more risk. A traditional partnership, you get the face value of what you sold your practice for. You get your partner's profit because they're working alongside of you. You get your profit because you're still working. And then you sell the remaining share in time. So that adds up to more potential value. And finally, the most value in terms of just potential is what we call the hybrid partnership, where you would get the face value of what you sold your partnership for. You get your partner's profits, your profits, and any other shares down the line. But again, that may be one of the more difficult. Those last two are more difficult to attract somebody. And quite frankly, they don't fit every practice sale. So this is why I said, if you're going to be flexible, you need to understand how that flexibility both affects the interest and the value. So with that, I'd love to get you to hone in on some decisions. I'd love to get you to hone in on what your next step would be towards your sale or transition. In fact, I want to kind of focus your attention to 3 actions. Now, depending on where you are in your practice, your career, your planning for your retirement, your sale, or your transition stage, it's likely that you're going to land in one of these 3 camps. And so I want to help you in each one of those camps. So the first is, you might be sitting here today listening to all this information, and you may end up with some of your hair blown off, and hopefully you don't look bald like me, but you might say, you know what, I need to gather more information because I didn't know all this stuff. I am likely not that far along in my process, or I have a lot to go. So this is best for someone whose transition or sale is still 5 or more years away, and you need to learn and gather some more information. And here's the good news. You have time. So here's what I'd love to offer you for being on this webinar with me today. I would like to offer you what we call a free transitions checklist, which is kind of a checklist and / test to see where you're at in terms of transition so that you can plan. And I'd love to offer you a discount on our Ultimate Chiropractic Exit Strategy program, which is dedicated to helping you plan for that future by educating you more on this process deeper than we can dive in this webinar. So if that sounds like you and you're in that category, all I want you to do is type gather into that questions panel. And then the good folks here at ChiroHealthUSA will get us your email information, and we will send you the checklist and a discount on the Ultimate Exit Strategy. So again, if you're 5 5 or more years away, still need to learn and gather more information, right? Gather. Now, there's a second camp of you who are on this webinar right now, and you're what I describe the grow camp. Literally, you need to build your practice a little more before you can sell it to maximize its value. Now, where are you at in the spectrum? Well, that would mean you still have 3 to 5 years away. And you need to grow that practice to maximize the value. But here is the most important bullet. It is that third one that you see on your screen, that you have time and energy to build, then sell or transition. So if you describe yourself as burnt out, completely tired, exhausted, fed up with chiropractic, then you may not have that third bullet that's needed. In other words, you might not have the time and energy to build and sell. But if you do, and your transition is still 3 to 5 years away, and people say, Tom, why do I have to be 3 to 5 years away? Well, you know what? It's not like you can put a few things in place and all of a sudden your value will skyrocket. Primarily, your practice value is based on the last 3 years of your performance. So if you only work it for a couple months to try to build it, you're not going to really affect the value much. But if you are in this category, I'd love to offer you a free focus session call. And here's what that is. I'm going to jump on the phone for 15 minutes with you and determine some growth points. In other words, point you in the right direction and how you could grow your practice. And if you want to be a part of our Build to Sell coaching program, we will give you a special discounted offer so that you can join to have us help you do that. But there's no obligation. Either way, we're going to determine some growth points and point that out for you. So if that sounds like you and your time frame and what you need to do, then I want you to just type grow into the questions panel, and we will go ahead and get you to offer for that free focus session, and we'll jump on the phone and talk about growth points for you. Now, there is a third category of you, and literally you need to go. And I don't mean right now you have to leave your practice, but literally what you are saying is, no, I'm ready now. I need to launch my transition plan. I need to get moving. I need to start. And here is your category, because you want to sell your practice within the next 0 to 3 years, or you want to transition it in the next 0 to 3 years so you can slow down, or transition it to an associate so that you can exit or move on to your next thing. So if that's you, then yes, the time is to go is now. And here's what I'd love to offer you. I want to be able to give you a free, no obligation strategy session call where we'll talk about your situation. And the first step in most of these cases is to literally put a price tag in your practice. In other words, to do evaluation, where we can say, well, this is what your practice would sell or transition for based on right now. And you're not under any obligation to work with us, but we'd love to give you a discount on that valuation for being on this webinar. And we'd love to speak to you about your situation so that we can see how or if we may be able to help you get to that next place. So if that's you, type go into the questions panel, and we'll get you the information for your strategy session and your free call. And with that, I'm going to confirm with Christy, in addition to these 3 gifts and offers, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Is that the case, Christy?
It is.
All right, awesome. So if you have other questions that I didn't answer here on this webinar, or that maybe the webinar brought up, then go ahead and type them in the questions panel. I also want to give you all some links in case you say, hey, you know what, I'm on the webinar, I want to go to that session right now, I want to schedule my strategy session and go. You can also use these links to do the same thing, strategicdc.com/go for the go offer, grow for the grow offer, and gather for the gather offer. But in the meantime, I'm going to take a quick sip of water and go ahead and type in your questions, and we'll just answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have left.
Ray.
All right. So let's see. Somebody wrote in, some old docs say modern software is a big necessity for making the practice marketable to young docs. What say you? So this is a tough question, and when we try to address it a little bit in the equipment section when we talked about that, because here's the problem that I see. Let's say you want to buy $15,000 worth of software. Well, nobody wants to buy it, but you go ahead and say, hey, I'm going to get this software. It's going to cost me $15,000. And your buyer says, man, I hate that software. I had that when I was an associate in this office. Man, I am really sad that you have that software because now I guess I'm going to have to use it because, it's kind of coming along with the practice that I purchased, or they're just going to go ahead and trash it and buy some other one. So my advice is, yes, it is certainly marketable and attractive if it's already present, but it is not valuable. In other words, it doesn't add enough value to your practice to go ahead and buy it if it's not. Because you then, if you don't have that software, you have the ability to be open, or the buyer has the ability to be open to insert their own preferences, their own software. Now, I even had a situation come about 2 years ago where this was on the short list of what the buyer wanted. And he was literally deciding that, hey, I don't know if I'm going to buy this practice because it doesn't have any software. Now, I will tell you, it's very difficult to compare apples to apples. In many cases, if a buyer is looking to practice in your town, they may not have any other practices to compare to. And even if they do, it's very difficult to compare apples to apples. So, literally is your practice the same price, the same volume, the same collections, the same technique, the same everything? Well, in this case, this was like a rare moment where a buyer had two practices to compare. And all we did to help the owner secure that buyer was say, well, we would credit you some money towards the sale or lower the purchase price by X amount of dollars for you to be able to purchase the software you want. And that won the day, giving him the flexibility of being able to buy the software and giving the buyer also a little discount and not losing the sale. So that's another option. And again, I just am real hesitant about people buying something that they don't know what the buyer will like. Here's the other part of it. I've been through enough software transitions and changes to know that it wreaks a bit of havoc on you and your staff. And the reality of the situation is one of the biggest things that all of you need to keep in mind with respect to your transition. In fact, I tell all my clients, if you could do nothing else during the transition or sale of your practice, do this one thing: keep your foot on the gas pedal. In other words, keep the income moving, keep the collections going. And if all of a sudden, because you're focused on trying to implement an EMR system that's brand new to you, the staff and everything, and you lose some collections, you will actually have lost twice. Once, because you'll have paid for that EMR system, and second, you'll have lost because now you've put your collections down lower, decrease them, and that does decrease the value of your practice, or at least potentially if you took a really big dip. So with that, again, just want to remind you of, yes.
This is Dr. Ray Foxworth, President of ChiroHealthUSA. I just wanted to jump on for a moment and thank you for sharing your insights with us. Unfortunately, you and I have been around long enough to see that sometimes the exit strategy is a funeral, and I hate that for our profession. And so this information is, I think, critical for us as chiropractors to be able to start looking at really creating a true career path for entering practice and exiting. So also, I want everyone on the call to know that Dr. Tom is absolutely one of my go-to guys on things related to compliance, but also in implementing rehab and therapy and massage therapy in our office, in our new office that we just opened. I've purchased his book on implementing massage therapy. As a matter of fact, I have every book that you have written, Tom. And I just found out you have a new one, and I'm really disappointed that it's out of stock. So when the referral book is available, please call Christy and get my credit card number.
We'll get it.
But Great information, and thank you for carving time out of your day to help us with this. And I would like to ask a question, if I may.
Certainly.
So, in a situation where if a doctor has a practice, and let's say it's seeing 300 patients a week, and a new doctor comes in to buy that practice, I'm sure you've seen this happen. They may have been in another practice where they were seeing a maximum of 150 a week. They come into a practice seeing 300 a week, and my experience has been it won't take long before they'll take a 300 visit a week practice down to 150, because either that's where their head, their comfort level, their skill set is. So when you are financing a practice, what types of things are with what you do, are you able to build in things that, deal with the unknown unknowns? Meaning, well, if you're not maintaining what we had and I'm financing it, are there ways to unwind that?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So I would say that the first thing, even before the financing part, is why we really emphasize what we call extended transitions, where you let's say you're the owner, Doc Ray, you don't hand them the keys and leave the next day on the sale. I mean, you want one good way for them to drive that thing down. That's it, But if you stick around for a little while afterward, and it hasn't mentioned in the webinar, that doesn't mean they have to do it for free, but essentially you're the best person to transition them so that they don't take it from 300 down to 150. So that would be one strategy that I would put in place first. In respect to your financing, the second strategy I would put in place is, if at all possible, don't finance the whole thing. And the reality of the situation there, it's not like you're selling them a rotten egg. You're selling them something great. But in some respects, maybe their own stubbornness, maybe their own unwillingness to learn things out of your control, then put risk in your corner where you wouldn't want it. And if they feel like, oh, well, I hate to say it, but you've seen this with respect to collections. If a patient owes you some money and you send them a letter says, hey, Mrs. Jones, you owe us $50. She may ignore that forever because she has a relationship with you, and she says, oh, good old Ray, he won't come after me for that $50. But if you say you send the exact same letter to a collections agency or somebody else and it says the same thing as you did, but on the letterhead it's different and it says $50, she'll pay them, won't she? Well, it's the same way with a bank. Now, the third thing, what you're asking is, if we went through a financing situation, are there ways to protect ourselves in terms of, down the line, we sold the practice, it performed at this level, I'm carrying the paper, I'm holding the note, and now I'm at a risk? And the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, we just set one of these up a couple of weeks ago with one of our clients who was buying in. And effectively, if the practice dips below a certain level, then the sale can either be called off or he loses a portion of his down payment as a contingency. You say, well, that sounds pretty harsh. Well, it might be harsh sounding, but the reality of it is what the buyer is losing is less than what the seller is losing. You take a 300 visit a week practice and take it in half, you're losing a lot more than 300 visits a week, and because I'm sure all those people are paying you something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So long answer, yes, you can put contingencies in place to do that. I'd try best to avoid it or to mitigate it before you even get there, though.
Gotcha.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tom, and thank you so much, Dr. Foxworth, for joining in today. He just couldn't resist himself because, did I mention, I'm not the only huge fan of Dr. Tom at ChiroHealthUSA. So definitely check out his strategicdc.com. It is, like I said, a go-to resource. Just a reminder, he is kicking off what I like to call the Circle of Friends on the webinar series, because all of my favorite people are going to be here this month. Starting next week is my very good friend, straight from California, Miss Holly Jensen. He's going to be talking about how to reduce stress at the front desk. And then we're going to be following it up the following week with how to communicate science appropriately with my girl, Dr. Heidi Havoc from New Zealand. And she's going to be broadcasting from the middle of the night in London, England, to make this happen. And then we're going to follow that up with Dr. Nicole Avina, who is currently working as an assistant professor at both Princeton University and Mount Sinai School of Medicine. So check it out. We have most of the webinars posted between now and June. And let me just tell you, Dr. Tom Necela, he's a rock star, and he is teed it up for a rock star lineup going all the way into the summer. So I hope you all have an amazing rest of your day and a fabulous week, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care, Tom.
Take care. Thanks for jumping on.
You bet.